The laws of sacrifices and offerings. According to the Old Testament, sacrifice was a key way to access, worship, and interact with God, whose personal name is YHWH, pronounced as Yahweh, which is usually translated as the Lord. God is perfect and cannot be in the presence of any blemish. God walked with man before man's rebellion entered the world. With the first failure, God and man were separated. However, God did not want to be separate from us, even in our failure. But since God is perfect, He must enforce perfect justice. To meet both goals, reunion and justice, God set rules for judgment. Each mistake must be paid for with equal value. God's only currency, what He values, is life that is blood. However, if He were to bleed His people, that would be counterproductive to reunion. Therefore, He instituted payment of blood through animals owned by people. Each mistake or sin would require blood payment from the man-owned animals, and in payment, God could be with man again. The priests who were cleansed of all sin first, so that they could aid in the sacrifice, because it's impossible to bring your payment to God if you can't get to Him. So they would take the animal from their flock, bring it to the priest. The priest killed the sacrifice, pouring blood out on the altar and burning the rest, according to God's instruction, and pray for the man to be forgiven and restored in God's sight. Sometimes sin was so great the sacrifices were done in bulk, large animals slain, and the priests would pray for the whole nation. In this context, a sacrifice was an offering that was given over to God in a ritualized manner, that is, through an activity system that was designed in such a way that it acknowledged belief in God. God was seen to have instituted sacrifice as a powerfully evocative, multi-purpose means for faulty human beings to demonstrate faith in Him, draw near to Him, receive His covenant to become His holy people, maintain His presence with them, be freed from guilt, regain purity, and celebrate His salvific actions on their behalf. In Genesis chapter 3, verse 21, we read, "The first sacrifice in the Bible was God Himself killing animal to make clothing, the coats of skins to cover Adam and Eve's nakedness." In Genesis chapter 3, Adam and Eve were wearing clothes made of fig leaves. God offered to give them something more suitable to wear and sacrificed animal to make the clothing. God's willingness to sacrifice animal to provide clothing and protection for Adam and Eve is an act of love and care, even in the immediate aftermath of Adam and Eve's disobedience to God. There are 5 main types of sacrifices or offerings in the Old Testament. The burnt offering can be referred in Leviticus chapter 1, chapter 6, verses 8 to 13, chapter 8, verses 18 to 21, chapter 16, verse 24. The grain offering can be referred in Leviticus chapter 2, chapter 6, verse 14 to 23. The peace offering can be referred in Leviticus chapter 3, chapter 7, verses 11 to 34. The sin offering can be referred in Leviticus chapter 4, chapter 5, verses 1 to 13, chapter 6, verses 24 to 30, chapter 8, verses 14 to 17, chapter 16, verses 3 to 22. And the trespass offering can be referred in Leviticus chapter 5, verses 14 to 19, chapter 6, verses 1 to 7, chapter 7, verses 1 to 6. Each of these sacrifices involved certain elements, either animal or fruit of the field, and had a specific purpose. Most were split into 2 or 3 portions: God's portion, the portion for the Levites or priests, and if there was a third, a portion kept by the person offering the sacrifice. The sacrifices can be broadly categorized as either voluntary or mandatory offerings. The order in which the core sacrificial prescriptions appear in Leviticus chapters 1 to 16 is logical and begins with previously known categories of sacrifices that individual Israelites could voluntarily offer. Leviticus chapters 4 and 5 introduce 2 new kinds of mandatory expiatory sacrifices that were instituted with the establishment of the sanctuary: sin offering and trespass offering. It makes sense in terms of didactic effectiveness that Leviticus chapters 1 to 5 introduce the 5 basic categories of sacrifices. First, burnt offering; second, grain offering; third, peace offering; fourth, sin offering; and fifth, trespass offering, one at a time before supplementary instructions in Leviticus chapters 6 and 7 that are primarily for the priests. Let us understand these offerings and sacrifices one by one. First, burnt offering. The importance of the burnt offering is shown by its position as the first sacrifice in Leviticus, the designation of the outer altar as the altar of burnt offering. This can be referred in Exodus chapter 30, verse 28, chapter 40, verse 7, and the role of the burnt offering as the regular morning and evening sacrifice that was to be continually burning on the altar. This can be referred in Exodus chapter 29, verses 38 to 42, and Number chapter 28, verses 1 to 7. The burnt offering was a voluntary act to express thanks, worship, devotion, and commitment to God. It was also used as an atonement for unintentional sin. The elements of the burnt offering were from the herd of oxen or flock of sheep or goats, or they could be turtle doves or young pigeons without blemish. Different procedures are listed for these animals in Leviticus 1, but in each case the meat and bones and organs of the animal were to be totally burnt, and this was God's portion. The animal's hide was given to the Levites, who could later sell it to earn money for themselves. Second, grain or meat offering. The second voluntary offering is the grain offering, in which the worshiper offers up the fruit of the field was offered in the form of a cake, or baked bread made of grain, fine flour, oil, salt, and frankincense. The grain offering is different from the other offerings because there is no blood involved. It was always offered along with burnt offerings, which can be referred in Numbers chapter 29, verse 6, thus complementing the burnt offering. The grain offering was one of the sacrifices accompanied by a drink offering of 1/4 hin, that is about a quart of wine, which was poured into the fire on the altar. This can be referred in Numbers chapter 15, verses 4 to 5. The purpose of the grain offering was to express thanksgiving in recognition of God's provision and unmerited goodwill toward the person making the sacrifice. Unlike the burnt offering, only a portion of the grain offering was burned on the altar, which can be referred in Leviticus chapter 2, verses 2, 9, and 16, with the rest consumed by the priests within the court of the tabernacle. This can be referred in Leviticus chapter 2, verses 3 and 10. The portion of grain that was offered on the altar was to have frankincense burned with it. This can be referred in Leviticus chapter 2, verse 15. Third, peace offering. The third voluntary offering was the peace offering, consisted of best and unblemished animal from the worshipper's herd and or various grains or breads. This was a sacrifice of thanksgiving and fellowship, followed by a shared meal. In Leviticus chapter 3, verses 14 to 16, we read, "The fat, kidneys, and lobe that is caul above the liver of the liver were given to God by burning it, and the remainder of the animal was for the participants to eat," symbolizing God's provision. The high priest was given the breast of the animal. The officiating priest was given the right foreleg. These pieces of the offering were called the wave offering and the heave offering because they were waved or lifted over the altar during the ceremony. The vow, thanksgiving, and free will offerings mentioned in the Old Testament and Hebrew scriptures were all peace offerings. Fourth, sin offering. The sin offering was mandatory, as it atoned for sins and cleansed from defilement. There were 5 possible elements of a sin sacrifice: a young bull, a male goat, a female goat, a dove or pigeon, or 1/10 ephah of fine flour. The type of animal depended on the identity and financial situation of the giver. A female goat was the sin offering for the common person. Fine flour was the sacrifice of the very poor. A young bull was offered for the high priest and the congregation as a whole, and so on. Portions of these offerings were offered outside the camp, and most aspects of these offerings aren't described as a sweet aroma to God. That's because sin and trespass offerings dealt with sin and trespasses, the breaking of God's law, which can be referred in 1 John chapter 3, verse 4. The sin offering dealt with the general sins of everyone: the priests, the leadership, the entire congregation, and the individual. This represented the truth that all have sinned and have become sinners by nature. This can be referred in Romans chapter 8, verse 7. Unlike the burnt offering, where the whole animal was offered on the altar, with the sin offering only the fat and blood were offered at the altar. When a bull was offered for the priest or for the whole congregation, the bulk of the animal's body was burned outside the camp. This was because it represented sin, which is repugnant to God, which can be referred in Psalm chapter 5, verse 4, Ezekiel chapter 18, verse 23. He wants it removed far from his sight. These sacrifices each had specific instructions for what to do with the blood of the animal during the ceremony. The fatty portions and lobe of the liver and kidneys were given to God, that is, by burning it. The rest of the animal was either totally burned on the altar and the ashes thrown outside the camp, that is, in atoning for the high priest and congregation, or eaten within the tabernacle court. Fifth, trespass offering. The trespass offering was the second mandatory and most holy offering, which can be referred in Leviticus chapter 7 verse 1, and this sacrifice was specifically a ram. The sacrifice is similar to the sin offering, but not exactly the same. The sin offering in Leviticus chapter 4 dealt with sin in general, among all classes of society. The trespass offering dealt with specific acts of transgressing God's law, such as breaking one of God's commandments, which can be referred in Leviticus chapter 5 verse 17, or doing something harmful to another person. This can be referred in Leviticus chapter 6 verses 2 to 3. The purpose of trespass offering was given as atonement for unintentional sins that required reimbursement to an offended party, and also as a cleansing from defiling sins or physical illnesses and conditions. Again, the fat portions, kidneys, and liver were offered to God, and the remainder of the ram had to be eaten by every male among the priests, and shall be eaten in the holy place, i.e., inside the court of the tabernacle, because it is most holy. Along with the trespass offering, the offender was required to compensate the victim of his or her sin and pay an additional amount. This can be referred in Leviticus chapter 5 verse 16, chapter 6 verse 5, Numbers chapter 5 verses 6 to 7. This showed that the offender still had a responsibility to make things right with the person he or she hurt. As such, this offering had an estimated monetary value of a ram, and one who owed another on account of a debt due to a sin could repay it by shekels of silver. This can be referred in Leviticus chapter 5 verse 15. In addition, a 20% fee was assessed and given to the priest who mitigated the debt. This can be referred in Leviticus chapter 5 verse 16. The trespass offering was to be performed like the sin offering for individuals other than the high priest, with the blood applied to the outer altar. Unlike the sin offering, the priest did not put the blood on the horns of the outer altar, but rather tossed the blood around the sides of it, as in the burnt and peace offerings. This can be referred in Leviticus chapter 7, verses 1 to 7. Through all of the above sacrifices, we see that sin, both unintentional and intentional, required an atonement. Praying and saying you're sorry just wasn't enough. Each kind of sacrifice had a unique procedural element that correlated with its distinctive significance. Except for the trespass offering, the unique elements involved treatment of the flesh or blood. The flesh of the burnt offering was completely burned. The offerers ate meat from the peace offering. The blood of a sin offering almost always went on the horns of an altar. The trespass offering required prior non-sacrificial reparation, and the non-animal grain, drink, and incense offerings had no blood or flesh at all. During the high holy days, from Rosh Hashanah, that is Yom Teruah, the Feast of Trumpets, to Yom Kippur, that is Day of Atonement, the Jewish people in Israel and around the world prepare their hearts and come humbly before God. They present themselves in repentance and humility, with hope that the Lord would accept their offerings. In prayer and supplication, they ask to be inscribed in the book of life for another year to come. The sacrificial system of the Old Testament was a means of grace by which the relationship between God and humanity begins to be restored. Ultimately, the sacrificial system was inadequate, which is why Yeshua the Messiah came to earth. None could repay the debt of life that was owed until Messiah defeated death once and for all. This can be referred in Hebrews chapter 10 verse 10. In the age of the church, we live in light of Messiah's meritorious sacrifice for us, while also offering our own lives as a living and holy sacrifice. This can be referred in Romans chapter 12 verse 1 and 1 Peter chapter 2 verse 5. As believers in Yeshua the Messiah, we have the assurance of pardon, and that our names are inscribed in the book of life, not by our works but through our faith, and we do not need to ask to be inscribed every year, as Messiah's work was and is final. The sacrifices in the Old Testament pointed forward to the perfect and final sacrifice of Messiah. As with the rest of the law, the sacrifices were a shadow of the things that were to come. The reality, however, is found in Messiah. This can be referred in Colossians chapter 2, verse 17. Believers today recognize Messiah's atoning death on the cross as the only needed sacrifice for sin, offered once for all. This can be referred in Hebrews chapter 10, verses 1 to 10. His death opened the holy place for us, which can be referred in Hebrews chapter 10, verses 19 to 22, so that we can freely enter God's presence and offer our sacrifice of praise. This can be referred in Hebrews chapter 13, verse 15, also in chapter 9, verses 11 to 28, chapter 4, verses 14 to 16, and chapter 5, verses 1 to 10. The Apostle Paul assures us that God, rich in mercy, loved us, even when we were dead in our transgressions, making us alive together with Messiah. This can be referred in Ephesians chapter 2, verse 4 to 6. Further, he says, Yeshua's sacrifice is in vain if I depended for my salvation in old sacrifices and offerings. It can be referred in Galatians chapter 2, verses 20 to 21, 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 14, 17, 54 to 55, 58, 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 21, chapter 6, verses 1 to 13. In Hebrews 10 also we read that these offerings and sacrifices were the shadow of Yeshua the Messiah.